Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of What Makes You Click. My guest today is Patrick Pageat, who may or may not be known to you. If he's not known to you, you probably know a lot of what he gets up to. I've known Patrick for quite a long time now. And I was just saying before we did the recording, this is probably the longest I've gone since I've known him that we've not actually met up. But Patrick, is the person who has pioneered the development of pheromonatherapy, but there's a lot more to him than that, which people may or may not realize. And we're going to talk about some of those issues. A little bit about Patrick's background. He obviously heads up the IRSI, which I will try and do in my French for the benefit, and Patrick will probably laugh as I desperately try to say. So it's Institut de Recherche en sémiochimie et éthologie appliquée. There we go. I'm getting a thumbs up. Those of you that are listening, I got a thumbs up for that at least. I just call it IRSI. Patrick founded the institute in 1995, I think, or its precursor. He's an associate professor at Toulouse University and has been for the best part of 10 years. He did his PhD in the Natural History Museum of France, which was on insects, I believe, and that's where the interest in pheromones comes from. But we'll talk about it. But Patrick does much more than insects, but he has recently done work on invertebrates and including insects. I noticed that amongst the publications, there were interactions with beetles as well recently, snails and beetles, which I thought was an interesting. There can't be too many people who've studied snail-beetle interactions, but there's a good ecological reason for that. And Patrick is one of those scientists who just gets fascinated by things. And so anything from invertebrates, fish, farmed animals, companion animals, chickens, there doesn't seem to be any limit to the areas that Patrick is interested in. He's also a very keen horseman, so we will talk about horses later on at some point. I noticed more recently you're starting to turn out publications in assistance animals as well and their welfare. So, but if you've used products like Feliway, Adaptil, Felifriend, Feliscratch, then this is the man who kicked them all off. But also a lot of the pheromone work looks at pheromones in the control of parasites and disease, and also human pheromones as well, which is an interesting area because there's still people who say that humans cannot detect pheromones and we don't have a vomeronasal organ. So that's probably a good point to say. First of all, hello and welcome, Patrick. Thank you for joining me today. It's good to see you.
Hello, I'm very happy to be with you, Daniel. Yes, yeah. I even don't remember exactly for how many years we know each other, but we could say that it's a long time.
Yeah, I think it's more than 25 years, I think. So it's been a long time. So no, it's lovely to see you. And I say, just sort of kicking off on that, actually, I'm just going to talk about some of the products, but working with the human side as well, that must be another level of complexity to everything.
Yeah, I think that I'm always been convinced, and it's a part of my approach to ethology and biology. For me, humans are just animals adapted to a special environment, which is the intellectual environment, making that we can leave the sensory context and create something else, which is our specificity, but we're animals. So, and we have a metabolism and we produce a subproduct of metabolism. So why not having chemical communication? And I'd say that there is something which is coming from long time ago, with obstetricians describing that some tissues rubbed on the breast of the mother was having an appeasing effect on the babies. Later on, some papers published by colleagues showing the same thing from the Montgomery glands, which are specific sebaceous glands on the breast that are activated just after giving birth. And so I think that our concerns and difficulties with accepting pheromones is much more related to the weight of some approaches like psychoanalysis, making that people think that we should be just brains and spirits more than brains, because even the brain begins to be a little bit too much flesh. So our approach has been to work on that and just saying, okay, first, we will forget everything which is about predisposition, brain predisposition, or intellectual predisposition to believe or not that it may exist. And let's see if there is something. And the surprise came again from chemistry, stupid chemistry and analysis. We, human or woman, release something which looks very much alike to animal maternal appeasing pheromones. So this is a first observation, and this is something in a paper we have in preparation. We have observed in a study we have run in a hospital that comparing women who are going to give birth and have decided to milk their babies and those who have decided to bottle the baby, we find exactly the same secretion. Meaning that it's not, as in animals, it's not related to milk production, it's related to something else, which is probably attachment. Mm-hmm. And it's very interesting because this secretion, when we have been beginning to work with, we have observed that it was having some effects that were very comparable to what we observe in animals. Stabilization of heart rate variability, decrease of stress-related signs, in children, for example, for a routine examination in hospital, exactly the same thing we observed, meaning that we had some scales that were administered by the nurse first, because in hospital, you first had the examination by the nurse, and then the pediatrician arrives. And we had this behavior evaluation and heart rate measuration at each step of the consultation. And with the same stability with the children, they were receiving the pheromone. It was very funny. It's a doll inside which we have put a polymer on which we have fixed the pheromone, and it's released this way. And we were also observing what the children were doing with the doll. And when it was the placebo doll, most of the children were leaving it somewhere because it was not interesting. Mm. And all the other children were keeping it, in the majority of the case, very, very close to their face. And it has been a big problem because according to the regulation in the hospital, we were obliged to ask people to give back the doll on leaving the hospital. And to every children, we were offering a neutral doll, physically the same, but the frustration in the children having the pheromone doll, it was incredible because some of them have been shouting, crying, the parents saying, please give him back the previous one. Sorry, we can't.
Yeah. Oh, no.
And so this observation has been great because we have later on, and it has been published with a team of psychiatrists, we have observed things that were very comparable in adults suffering bipolar disorders regarding their clinical signs related to anxiety. So it's very interesting, and also separation related disorders in humans, showing that we have something which is very interesting. And it's my pleasure to say that the industrial part of our group, because now we have it, will launch this human pheromone in a few months now. Everything is almost ready. So
oh, wow, brilliant.
It's a medical disposal.
Yeah, oh, well, that's really good. And I just want to flag one thing, because I thought it was really interesting. And this is something that passes people by quite often. You mentioned quite early on about heart rate stabilization. And, and I think that is such an important element of what we see in a lot of these pheromones. And I'm sure we'll get to talk about sort of people's misunderstandings of the pheromones and trying to treat them as if they're drugs, and they're not. But yeah, when you look at the data, that's one of the things that we see, across the trials that we do, is that the variability in heart rate data and the variability in behavior nearly always just becomes much more homogeneous in the pheromone group. And so
Absolutely.
what you're seeing is obviously those that are stressed coming down, but you're just seeing that aggregation. And that's why, it's not like a drug where you put something in and you lower everybody down. And so, the statistical methods of just comparing this population against this population, and it's so easy to do badly designed trials and say, well, there's no significant difference. And if you don't think of it in terms of its role in stabilization, then, as I said, it's easy to get the wrong measure of it. But just before we leave the human side, because I find this fascinating, and one thing I forgot to say at the beginning is also we're gonna be talking about the French approach, and people may or may not be familiar. The French approach historically is very different to much of the rest of the world, and Patrick is the person who kicked it off. But we'll talk more about that in a bit. So, you still see, though, in human anatomy texts that they say there is no functional pheromonasal organ in humans. And if I understand correctly, that when, somebody has nose work, they have the nose remodeled, it seems to be one of the things they whip out, the pits in the nose.
Yeah, I think there are different things to it. There are some myths and there is some reality. The myth of the VNO not existing anymore in adults is a mistake. There are different papers. There is an excellent paper published in 2000 by a team who made some research with medical imaging. It was MRI, and they were introducing some contrast liquid in the VNO in volunteers, just having the volunteers with the open duct of the VNO because they didn't want to force it and make some lesions. And it's very interesting to say that they were measuring the cavity inside the VNO. And with this, I don't say it's a passive way to measure it, but since you don't force, you just have an evaluation of the cavity as it is in this real moment. And it was going from 3 millimeters to 13 millimeters.
Okay.
So for a non-existing organ, and Mr. Jacobson, who made the dissections without knowing what was the function of this organ, has described very well this organ. We also have some fibroscopic examination made by the surgeons and doctors in charge of making examination of the first part of the respiratory tract. There is histology also about that, showing exactly the same structure as in animals, with some exceptions, some differences. The main difference is not related to the presence of neurons, because there are neurons even in adults. The main difference is more about the development of the cartilage that is surrounding the VNO. This cartilage, which is really wrapping the VNO in most species, in mammals, of course, because in birds it's different. But in mammals, you're really a kind of roll of a cartilage around, which will play a role for the pumping system, because it will create some limits in the capability of the organ to have a dilatation, and everything will be made against the cavity, meaning that this is why we have this pumping activity in the VNO, depending on the pressure of blood in the tissues. In human, we have everything except that the cartilage is a little bit weaker than in other species. And in addition, some paper published in, if I'm not wrong, I think it's 2010, 2015, with the approach of the genome and with the presence and the expression of genes encoding for receptors, VNO receptors, have shown that there are some functional genes in human, but a lower number. So there are some discussions, is it 2 or 3 functional genes, which doesn't mean that you just have 2 receptors, because you have some post-traductional differences that exist, but there are functional genes. And something which is also maybe specific of human and possibly primate species, is the presence also of such receptors in the olfactory mucus. We have to keep in mind that the neurons, whatever the mammalian species, the neurons in the VNO are GnRH neuron migrating during the prenatal development. And those neurons, some of them will stop the migration into the olfactory mucus. So the VNO is, let's say, kind of very specific entity in the detection of pheromones, but it's not the only one. And if we go back to birds, birds do not have any VNO. In birds, you just have a part of the nasal mucus and cavity that is specialized. Fish do not have any VNO. Invertebrates, we just find it in reptiles and mammals. We don't have it in birds or fish.
Yeah.
So we don't have to make a kind of absolute relationship between VNO and pheromone detection. And even, for example, in dogs, cats, whatever, it's very clear that there are some neurons expressing genes for encoding for receptors in the olfactory mucus. So it is not 100% VNO.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. And again, I like your comment about sort of, well, you treat humans just as they're just another species. When I did one of these with Don Broom, and he was sort of, yeah, he's very much trying to promote one biology. Let's get away from this idea that humans have a special place in it all. They're just another species in another niche. And I think that's so important. And I think, I mean, and this is something, well, this sort of connects to your work. So you pioneered the development of what is commonly called the French approach. And I have one of the editions of your book here, Pathologie du comportement du chien. There we are. That's twice I've tried French. And you know, that was one of the reasons why I got interested in what you were doing, because I became aware of this book actually when I was in practice, just after I graduated. My boss went, I think, to WSAVA, and you were speaking, and he came back and said, oh, you're interested in behavior. I heard this guy talk, and I think they were probably the first English notes you'd provided on the topic.
Probably.
But this is a very, for want of a better word, it's more like the human medical psychiatric approach to dogs. Now, one of the things that I found absolutely fascinating, and I can't claim fame, but, you know, I did work with you to try and get this book translated into English, and there's another story there. And with a colleague who spoke fluent French, we sat down and we got an English translation. And there's several things that sort of struck me about it. First of all, as I said, everything is sort of codified for the different conditions. And whereas one of the things that we looked at early on in my academic career was just the variability. And, you know, one person uses a term in English like separation anxiety, and it means something completely different to somebody else who calls separation anxiety, whereas things are much more clearly defined with their criteria in this sort of approach, and there are protocols in that system. Now, the other thing is there are some fascinating insights into animal behavior here as well that supplement it. So when you talk about some of the emotional disorders, and you talk about whether or not the animals are more oral, perhaps in their exploration of objects, and they were just things that had never, that I could see, been reported in the English literature. And subsequent work has validated some of those observations. So, I mean, there's to me, there's this sort of slight strange thing that this is as I said, a very medical model, as opposed to me, or what I would consider a very biological approach, which is what you sort of are very much at the heart of. But equally, I mean, this seems to be supported by a wealth of research. And it was great because, as I said, very few people actually read a foreign language. But, you know, you brought together, you know, people's theses from here, there, and everywhere in France that people had developed this. So So my first point is, if people are interested in this, if you read French, read the book, because it's fascinating. It has some insights. It is a different approach. There is an English version in Gary Landsberg's book, which I have here as well. In several of the editions, you wrote the chapter which sort of brought together some of the stuff to give people insight into it. But how did you get to that approach? We'll talk about I think you've moved on from that in a way, and you've become more biological. I seem to remember at one meeting you were saying, so you actually sort of saying words to that effect. But I mean, you went from being in somebody's lab, working on insect pheromones, to producing a book which is very much a codex, pretty much a Bible on this is how to deal with behavior problems. And it wasn't just sort of, well, here are some ideas. Here are a lot of protocols. There's a lot of studies behind this. How did you get to that point? Because, you're not that old.
First, thank you very much for your comments. I could tell you also that I have appreciated very much the translation as far as I can evaluate the quality of the translation with my poor English. But I'd say that it was looking very, very well translated and being really what I was willing to write. I'd say that first, if I try to explain how it went, I'd say that I was a student at the vet school of Lyon, where there were some professors who historically were interested in that field, especially because they had been for, let's say, geographical sometimes reasons, because they were close to a hospital where we had in France at that moment, before, when those professors were younger, we had a French psychiatrist who has written a lot of books that have modified the approach of psychiatry, and especially Professor Henry A.E.Y. And he has developed a school around that. And he has inspired some vets. I've been very strongly inspired. I think that this book, in some parts, is one of the inspiring persons. But I was a student and I was looking at what was happening with the animals having problems, say to have an unacceptable behavior, like, of course, biting, scratching people, but also urinating or destroying things. And I was at the same time in my training for insect ethology. And when you work on insects, maybe some people can have some kind of personal projection in what they're observing, but it's when you are observing. I've been doing my PhD about wasps that are predators of bees. And let me say that I was enjoying to observe it, but I had no projection. I have never thought that I could be a wasp, or that the wasp was like me. So you are obliged to be very, very open-minded, because you are obliged to just describe what you see. And when I've been at the vet school with looking at some consultation made by my professors, I was a little bit surprised with the idea of putting a label on what the animals were doing, a label that was just based on the owner's claims. So we had some jealous dogs, some cats doing a revenge by peeing on the pillow of the owners or things like that. And those bad guys were to be disciplined with different methods that were going from sometimes just some physical punishments, but very quickly to some medical treatment that were just to put them down with using products like some neuroleptics and some anti-epileptic drugs. Neutering was a key thing, because everything was sexual, probably contamination by psychoanalysis. And so I was not convinced because I was observing the animals and I was not satisfied. So I first made my personal descriptions. And looking at, and there has been some two authors that have been crucial for me. One was Henriet, the psychiatrist I have said, and all his school, because he has had a lot of students, and also Piaget, with the development of behavior. And as an ethologist, for me, the behavioral development has always been, and it's still, for me, a key to explain many things that we observe. And so I have tried to put all that stuff together and mix it to begin to try to create some model. And also using some statistical approach to try to see if some behaviors I was observing or that I was obtaining from some better description by the owners were or not associated with the others, leading to the idea that a diagnostic was the aggregation of the presence of some signs that were describing progressively the loss of adaptability. Because I'm still convinced that if behavioral pathology exists, it is something which is destroying the function of behavior. And what is behavior, in my opinion? It is the capability of living beings to cope with the surrounding immediately, not with the evolution, because if you have to cope on evolutionary timing, you will be dead and all your children will never exist because you have not found the solution.
Just in relation to that, I was reading a paper just in preparation for our students who've just come back. And, you know, Tim Bergen's 4 questions, they talk about function. And Pat Bateson said we shouldn't talk about it in terms of function. We should talk about it in terms of current utility, because what it evolved for functionally is completely different potentially to what it's being used for now. And it's really neat, that observation. I think that, yeah, whilst as biologists we want to think in terms of evolution, that's not always the right way to think about a current trait, because, you know, feathers didn't adapt for flight, they adapted for insulation. And, yes, you know, so. Sure.
And yeah, if you look at the model I have tried to create, something which is also one of the red lines I have followed all the time was also the idea of how a behavioral disorder was going to have an evolution, how it was going to deteriorate progressively cognition and emotional balance. And I have been also using, in the purpose to try to test some hypothesis, I have used also the drugs. And I'd say that I was very much, I did a little bit the same thing that has been done with the drugs in the US, with using sometimes the drugs to see. I've been very lucky because I had a lot of freedom when I've been doing that. Meaning that because I was having this training, this education in ethology, my boss in that time, Professor Fontaine, who has been a wonderful person for my work, he has allowed me to do a lot of experiments with the patients. There was just one rule between us, because I was a student and not entitled to sign a prescription. And he told me, I will sign your prescription if you can convince me and explain me why you want this drug.
Neat. That's good. So that, yeah, okay. That's a good professor. That's a good professor, because they're asking you, you justify it and I'll support you in your opinions, even if I don't know exactly what you're doing, if you make a logical argument. And that's a great mentor to have, somebody like that.
It was a great mentor, and also for the clinical approach to patients. And I have to say that the second wonderful opportunity I have had was the enormous number of patients I have had, because and it was sometimes difficult to manage, because some professors were a little bit surprised and shocked that a student could have appointments and consultations, because I began this work a little bit when I was student in third year. In fourth year, I had an established consultation, and I have been after graduating, I have been allowed to continue and have this work, and it has been the topic of my vet thesis, which is in fact historically the first version of the book.
Right. Right.
And there has been, we can say that more or less there have been 3 editions of this book.
Yeah.
The vet thesis, the first edition, and the second edition that you have shown.
Yeah.
If I have something to regret, no, I don't regret, but there are things that are not what I was willing to do. First, in my opinion, it was something that was to be evolving over time, as I think that behavior is a way to cope with the current reality. I think that the scientific work is supposed to move on with the evolution of ideas, knowledge, research. And something happened which has led to something that I dislike, but you know it perfectly, which has been, to name it, the French approach. Okay. Because it has created, unfortunately, it has created something like a church. With people using this book and what I was teaching, because it was what was taught mostly in France. People have been beginning to regard it as the truth. The development and the creation of a French diploma of specialization has been making things worse. And we have reached a situation that was, for me, the most surprising thing, but historically there are some other examples, which has been that people have been very, very shocked, especially those who graduated based on the book, which has been when myself, I have been discontinuing to use some concepts because they appeared to me that they were not really making sense anymore with this definition, and including other things. And then there has been a kind of crisis. And I have to say that the result is that nowadays, as the guy who has initiated that, I have no longer any real relationship with the French school.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because yeah, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but yeah, the second edition. What was that? That was just trying to look what year that was. I've got it here. 98. So yeah, so
98, yes.
So we're talking 23 years on, and you know, and I don't want to sort of insult your colleagues in France, but it sounds as if they've not appreciated that science is only as good as is the current idea, and they seem to have got caught in time 23 years ago. This is what was said, and I don't know how much evolution there has been of the ideas. There's certainly not another edition of the book, and I know people are taking some of the ideas, and you know, you do see the odd paper that talks about this or that, and it makes reference to the original source, but it's not evolved anything like the rest of the field has, you know. And likewise in you know, I'm thinking in America, where also there was quite a lot of, pardon me, emphasis on the use of medication. Ideas have evolved, though. People have moved forward, and you know, the work that I've been doing as well, you know, and I'm trying to knit things together. And with my own master's students, it changes from one year to the next. I think the pace of change and of ideas. But do you think, you know, yeah, one of the strengths of the approach is here is a point of reference, and vets like points of reference. You know, they like to know this is how you treat this condition. And that is also its downfall, or you know, that actually people say, yeah, this is, yeah. And it's not evolved.
You're right. I don't know if there. I think yes, there is the equivalent in English, but in French we are used to speak about clinical practice as an art.
Yeah,
and I think it's. There is something which is very true, which is that when you are in your consultation room, when you are doing your job with your patients, ethically, you cannot do research really in that moment, because your patients, in our case, the owners of our patients, are expecting from us that we will make a diagnostic and propose a treatment that has been proven to have good results, to have a reasonable efficacy. So it's clear that in this purpose, especially if you are more involved in clinical practice, you like to have something which is structured and make that you have some hope to be capable to predict something. So we always have to keep in mind that in our mission, there is, in the end of the examination, there are three things that people are expecting from us. One is a kind of step, which is making that you show, this is my way to understand it, the clinician shows that he understands what it is with putting a name on the story. This is a diagnostic. The second point is the prognosis. And this is this is very important, the prognosis, because people are willing to know whether or not there is some reasonable hope that it will move favorably. And third point, the treatment. And the treatment is an agreement. It's a kind of agreement which is not really signed between the two actors of the story, or because again, the animals are not signing, but it's in that case, it's more comparable to pediatric medicine. But I think that those steps make that there is some kind of stress in the clinicians, and having a book makes that it's something that will appease a part of this stress. You know, from the hello, good morning, how are you, to the end of the consultation, have a nice day, and leaving with the prescription, you know the way you have to proceed. But it is creating something which is extremely dangerous from a scientific point of view, which is that it will freeze everything. And we all know it is our job, yours, mine. We know that the most difficult is to try to obtain that something will change. It's true for clinical situations, but it's also true for our daily life. When we introduce a new method, a new treatment, a new concept, our difficulty is not to teach that. It's to obtain that people go to the idea that they will include it in their way to practice, which means that they will change something. And I think that it is a danger with books.
It's interesting because the other thing with books is obviously they're usually a year or two out of date by the time they've been published. But it's such a valuable source of reference, and that was the thing, you know, when I first sort of went through the book with the translation and whatever. To me, what I loved about it was the wealth of ideas there. This was a way of looking at things which was very different to how, you know, that say one of the reasons why I started these podcasts, I started off with people that when I was a student, I went to America. I was told to go to America because there wasn't much going on in the UK. And, you know, I met people like Ben Hart, Kathy Hout, etc., and they've remained good friends. When I was introduced to your book and I was trying to make sense of it, largely not just because it was in French, but also just sort of, it was such a different approach, but it was so valuable because it was so refreshingly different. And I think it's fair to say in our field, it's a real shame that sort of freshness is not as well embraced as I think it should be for fueling scientific inquiry. And you mentioned that the book, you said sort of the books can be dangerous. And I don't know if I've told you this. I think I may have told you this. When we went to a publisher with the English translation, the person, they had to put it out for peer review. And they said they wouldn't be publishing it because one of the reviewers came back and said, this book in English would be dangerous. Now, and I was stunned by that, and I was thinking, well, why on earth would anybody say that? And I think it's so important that people get to read it and see it and what is going on, and see it in that context. And we'll have to have a separate chat outside this to see if legally we can create an open access English translation version that everybody can access and read and see the ideas.
I'm very happy with that.
Yeah, I just have to check with the copyright, but I think, because I think it's a really useful point of reference. The translation isn't as polished as it might be, but for people to see the ideas, because that's what inspires us to, as scientists. And yeah, it's just understanding that and seeing the different approaches, I think, are really important. And yeah, just to get to grips with that. It was interesting because I mentioned earlier, one of the early pieces of work that I did when I was when I first joined academia, SIVA were moving into the field, and a guy called Thierry Badon, you probably remember, he came over and he said to me, what did I think was the most important thing in the field at the moment? I said, well, at the moment, I think we're all speaking a different language. And I really want us to get to grips with, the terms we're using. Because I was aware that, the way I use this term, and especially they were starting to get drugs, clomipramine being licensed for separation anxiety. And I was thinking, these diagnostic criteria are not that great. And to their credit, they gave us a chunk of money for my research assistant, Jill Shepherd, to go around the world and go and chat to people and find out, what do you understand by this term? And she did several things. She asked people about terminology, and there it became apparent that cognitive dysfunction and involutive depression seem to be the same thing, just depending on your background, your cultural background. The separation anxiety, we saw loads of contradictions, both in key diagnostic terms, but also in treatment recommendations, which was, to me, quite worrying. And this got me quite interested in this. But the other thing Jill did was she presented people with vignettes, and she gave them these little histories. Now, if you asked somebody, and this was one of the things, if you asked somebody in France, what are the diagnostic criteria for separation anxiety, they would rattle off the list from the book. And there was much better agreement amongst the French clinicians than any other group on that basis. Likewise with treatments. However, if you then said, here is a vignette, what's your diagnosis? And it presented them with information. And this, I don't know whether this is true or not, but we got the impression that the way some of the French clinicians were using the work was, you only ask these questions and you ticked it off the sheet. And once you've got all of those questions, you've got your diagnosis. What they weren't doing was asking for a wider history. And we gave them a wider history in this vignette. So they were much more likely to come back with multiple diagnoses for these cases. So you have this irony that the French were being more precise, because if they could refer to things, but when presented with a case and with information, which maybe they wouldn't normally ask about, suddenly this dog had 3 or 4 different conditions, because it had some of the features of separation anxiety, some of the features of attachment disorder, or whatever. And yeah, I don't want, as I said, I don't want to come across as condescending, but it just came across that, yeah, there was an over dependence on the text and not enough thinking about and exploring of the case. And that, I think, because that was one of the early bits of work that I did when I moved into academia from practice, I think that had a really big influence on me. And I've sort of been hungry to listen to different people's approaches. And it's a shame there isn't more dialogue, I think, like that. And, I don't think I'm certainly not telling you anything you don't know, but there can be these political camps. And I think you've been probably more of a victim of it than anybody else in the field with the pheromone stuff. There are still some people who just don't get it, and they don't. And I get the impression it's not that they don't get it, they don't want to get it, almost. And I think that's a real shame in science, when you've got somebody who has got this complete blind spot. But anyway,
yeah.
that's my
Just-
rant. Before I go on.
I'd make two short comments about that. I'd say that we have probably, it will be not very nice what I will say, but it's really something that I strongly experience, let's say every given day. I think that there is one big trap with our field of behavioral medicine, applied ethology, but mostly with behavioral medicine. And the trap is based on two feet. One is that we are speaking about something which is related to vet medicine. And there is a kind of tradition that vets have the feeling that everything which is related to animals is something they know.
Mm.
Second is this strange idea that behavior is a kind of weak or soft science where we are more telling stories about animals than speaking about strong, heavy science. And so everybody has an opinion.
Mm.
And this opinion is supposed to be as good as the opinion from people who are doing research and have dedicated their life about that. And so it's a big question, because people, and this is one risk with this book as with others, but probably it's, of course, you put your personality in a book. And in my training, I've been also doing a lot with insects, a lot of taxonomy. And when you do taxonomy, the diagnostic criteria are very strong. You count the number of hairs, the length of this and that. And so this is one problem. But I'd say when maybe I was a little bit excessively bad with this book, because the consequences of this book have not been the same, for example, with the Spanish-speaking people who have been using it and have mixed it with other approaches. If we look at our colleagues from Barcelona, they use it, but they mix it with others, which is the way it has to be used.
Yeah.
You have been speaking about a Bible, and I regret that it is looking like a Bible when it is not a Bible. The Bible is a Bible.
Yeah.
This is a book.
Yeah. No, and I think that's true. Yeah, that's because I have obviously have the copy of it, and with my residents, we get the odd case. They come to me and I say, right, okay, this is what you need to know. This is actually really well described in the French approach, and it's really useful in that respect. And it's as you say, it's people not moving and putting it too much into as a single point of reference. But yeah, as I say, outside this call, we will have a chat and see if we can contact your publisher and say, look, would you allow the copyright of the English version?
There's some probability.
Yeah, because I think, because as I said, because then people can use it and use it in the right way. And as I said, it's the basis of ideas. And given its age now, then hopefully people will also realize that things should have moved on. But it helps. I think it helps foster understanding when you understand other people's perspectives on things. But let's roll back a little bit though, because so we've got to you as an undergraduate vet student, starting off on doing all of this stuff, but then you chose to do a PhD on insects. So how did you go from sort of, I'm passionate about psychiatry as it applies to animals, oh, I know what I'll do a PhD on insects.
No,
where did that come about?
No, I'm sorry to say that the story is much more bizarre than this. In the French system, you have a kind, it's not an exam, it's more a competition to be accepted in the vet schools. And in this process, which can last 1 year, 2 years, sometimes more, before being accepted, you study a wide range of questions in biology, and invertebrate species are part of it. And when I began this preparation of to be accepted in the vet school, I arrived there and I was more than interested by insects from the age of 7, 8. And when I say interested, I was preparing insect. I was breeding insect. My mother and my father were very tolerant. My sister was less acceptable. Accepting
I had stick
these
insects
presents.
as a kid.
But I was drawing insects. I was studying and reading everything that was accessible. And so insects and invertebrate species were a part of my life. And I entered in the vet school. And when I was in the beginning of the second year, I got an award. In that time, the Dutch company Philips, well known for TVs and etc., was sponsoring a wonderful competition for young scientists with an incredible jury, because we had Nobel Prizes, we had whatever the field, physics, chemistry, biology, you had the cream of the cream to evaluate the work. And I got an award for a work I presented about an insect that is still fascinating me, which is mantis, this green
the praying mantis, yeah.
Yes. And I discovered a special behavior in the male to escape the female. Some males, just because I was studying populations, and I was surprised to see some males having just one front leg and the other part being cut. And I observed that some of those males were using a strategy to disconnect the attack by the female, because they're very interested by everything which is moving. And when they were threatened by the female, they were just moving one front leg. They were losing it, but they were alive.
They were alive and they got to mate.
They were dying very, very soon, because with a single forelimb to catch sprays, it was not very effective. And so I described it. I got an award. And I was invited by a famous French professor of insect ethology, Professor Chauvin, who had been publishing a lot about honeybees and others, to do a PhD. So I began research in ethology when I was student in the beginning of my second year of vet school. And this is what made that my professor of medical pathology accepted that when I was asked to find some topic for my vet degree, to do it on behavioral disorders in dogs and cats. And I've been applying to dogs and cats the methods I was learning to study behaviors in insects. But I did such a big work for this research on a fascinating insect, because I've been working on a predatory wasp, which name is, sometimes we name it the wolf of the honeybees. It's a terrible honeybee that is wasp that is paralyzing honeybees to put them paralyzed into its nest, put an egg, and the larvae will have fresh meat. It's horrible, because the bees are alive and they're eaten alive.
Yeah.
And so I've been doing my PhD about that. But I was shared between my patient for that and for the pet species that I was treating for behavioral disorders.
Right. So you're running the two in parallel. There's a new series on the BBC actually, and I saw a bit of it at the weekend, and I absolutely fascinating. And I know I'm talking arachnids, not insects, about spiders. And I've never heard this before or seen this before, but they were showing this spider, and the male presents the female with a fly that is wrapped up in silk, and while the female unwraps it and eats it, then he gets the chance to mate. And okay, that you see that a lot in the insect world, but there are some spiders who have now, what they do is, if they can't catch a fly, they find either a dead fly, or they even found like a flower and wrap it with silk, which is of no nutritional value to the female, and they can still get away with it. And you just think, wow, this is...
You have also a predatory fly, which is doing that. The male is obliged to offer something to the female, and it's also in a kind of, it's wrapped in silk. And usually it's a small fly which is offered, but if there is no fly, they give an empty present,
Yeah.
it's very dangerous.
And
It's very dangerous because if there is nothing to eat, there is always a male to eat. So
exactly. And that's
you
what
have to be a very fast guy and very effective. But it's funny.
That's exactly what they were saying with the spiders as well. Yeah, because if the female doesn't like the gift, she kills the male. And
you have a lot of nice. I think we have to be careful because we're discussing between men, and we could suggest that lying is a specialty of males in living beings. But it's true that in spiders, you have also some males who are moving the net to attract the female on some line, and they run very fast to mount the female during the time she's going in another direction, which is also kind of very sophisticated lie.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating, and as I said, the complexity of behavior even in vertebrates, and it opens up so many questions on, what is cognition and how these strategies actually develop. Sure. Okay, so let's sort of. I'm fascinated with this story, and as I say, I know I've heard bits, and I remember you telling me a story about your PhD supervisor, and he would come down. I think you said something like on a Wednesday, and he'd randomly give people a topic, and they have to do a presentation. I know the story, but do you want to tell the story for those people who don't know? Because I just think it is because again, it is a brilliant way of giving a skill that you can research anything. So do you want to tell the story?
Yeah, it was we were. The place where he was doing research was incredible because it was an old castle in the center of France, in a fascinating surrounding with a lot of wild nature around. And we were the students, the PhD students, we were there all together, especially during summer when we were using this opportunity to have continuous experiments, especially for people like me working on insects. Summer is the key period to have everything available. And so it was funny because we knew perfectly the system. Everybody on Friday was trying to be as invisible as possible because we didn't know who was going to be caught by him, because he was doing his job as every given day, especially going to take care of his bees. And I still see him he had very heavy white hairs, a bird, and he was going to the bees wearing a short and a t-shirt. And sometimes he was discussing with you, and there was a bee stinging him, and he was taking it very softly and removing it this way, telling, no, it's not a problem. So it was a very strange person, speaking ancient Greek perfectly, and Latin also. And so a kind of Harry Potter character, we could say. And suddenly he was catching one of us and telling, tomorrow for our team meeting, and I usually had invited other professors, tomorrow you will speak about this. And it was always something that was not your matter of research. So it could be very far from your question. And we were supposed to remember that being a dinosaur, I can speak of a time when Google did not exist.
Yes.
So we had the library of the lab, and to find your way to have something reasonable to tell. And he was asking the questions, and the guest professors also. But it was very good training because you had to prepare something and try to do your best to also be able to answer questions and have a critical approach to the literature.
Yeah, no, and as I said, I think it is a great schooling. Unfortunately, we wouldn't get away with doing that with our students now. We have to be much nicer to them.
Sure.
So at what point did you start to, where did the connection with the pheromones come in at what point?
The clinical practice. The clinical practice, because I have to say that During my first years teaching at the vet school of Lyon and also doing a clinical practice just before being graduated, spraying cats were the population among cats. We had some aggressive cats, but mostly it was spraying and scratching on the walls and furniture cats. And so again, they were neutered. They were getting. I saw some cases with horrible surgery, with moving, trying to move the penis to make that the spray was going down, but in the end, it was urine, whatever happened. There has been some attempt of surgery with section of the olfactory peduncles, with the idea that no smell, no spray, except that they were not eating at all anymore.
I remember reading that in Ben Hart's book. When I was thinking, no, surely not. Let's obliterate the sense of smell. That will control. And thinking,
yeah, sure.
No, and it's funny because I mentioned that to students, and you can always used to come up in the exams. I think, no, that's the method we don't use. That's the one they remember.
And so we had those cats, and again, I did the same thing as with the other behavioral problems. I went to some houses to observe the cats, spraying cats, to see if I was seeing something special. And something that has been my way to catch first the idea has been that probably I was lucky, because it's not something that you observe in every spraying cat. But a lot of the first cats I observed were having a very obvious decrease in the frequency of facial rubbing. And so I began to be very, very focused on that. I did something which was kind of stupid, crazy experiment. I was using fluorescein, the fluorescein you use in ophthalmology, and putting it on the cheeks of the cats. And I remember that with UV light and going in the house to see where I was finding these fluorescing on the furnitures and walls and everything, to try to understand what was happening. It has been the way I have observed that there were some connections with the best and preferred tracks of the cats. And then I've tried to see, and my idea was that there was something which was released. And I remember a discussion with the professor of biochemistry who told me, I don't know if your hypothesis is right, but it's not feasible. Okay, and so I have been obliged to wait for almost 6 years before having, thanks to some friends who were working on pheromones in insects, to have the possibility to make some gas chromatographic examination, analysis of the secretions. And from that, during all that period, there are some lectures I have given in France about that. I was using compresses, surgical compresses, rubbed on the face of the cat, and I was asking the owners to place it on the places where the cat was spraying or scratching. It was working, but you can imagine the kind of crazy work for the poor clients. I was lucky. I had some very, very compliant ones, but it was not really feasible. And then I have been beginning to try to understand what were the interesting compounds in the middle of this mixture. I've made some associations, and my wife could tell you that the first bottles of Feliway, it was not named Feliway in that time, the first bottles of Feliway have been prepared in our kitchen. The only rule between us was that I swear that it was not toxic. And so I have prepared it, and I was not equipped to prepare some sprays. And we found, with a colleague, a jail in France where the prisoners were having an economical activity to prepare some cosmetics, and they were bottling it and putting the spray. And so the first sprays of Feliway have been prepared in a jail.
Wow.
I was giving the bottles, the big bottles, and they were producing the small ones.
Well, maybe with the human one that, you know, is involved in attachment, maybe many of them would benefit from that if they could get exposed to it. So, and as they say, the rest is history. And, you know, I've noticed with the pheromones in recent years, you know, that you seem to have moved much more into that, molecular genetic side, with the characterization of the molecule and stuff like that to make refinements in it. I mean, clearly you've always had that interest in, you know, the analytical chemistry, but the sort of structural modeling stuff, that's not easy.
You know, it's I'm still convinced that I don't say they're the last, but it's one of the few transmitters or chemical transmitters, the pheromones and the semiochemicals, that we have, let's say, neglected. We have neglected it for different reasons. First, because there was a big misunderstanding. The name pheromone has given the idea that it was single compounds, and it has been a big fight. You know it perfectly during the first years, and especially around Feliway, with some people still thinking that pheromone was like hormones, a single compound, when in reality it is a different way to communicate, which is fascinating because it's so simple. And what it's so simple from a chemical point of view, the molecules are very simple. And it's like when you write a letter, it's very simple. A is very simple thing to produce. Associated, it gives incredible options. And we could say the same. When you have, for example, a molecule like oleic acid it's such a simple molecule. But oleic acid associated with others will carry an information. If you go from that point and you do my job, you say, okay, I'm very happy. I work like a parrot. I listen. In that case, I analyze. When I have the feeling that I have identified the sentence, I write the same thing, and I write the same thing, and I repeat. Okay. But apart from it, I still don't speak chemical cat or chemical dog or whatever. So if I want to be able to do better, I have to understand the way it is caught, the way it is detected, the way it will activate. So it has been more, the first step has been first to see what it was activating. Why? Because it was more accessible, because you can measure hormones in the blood or in other parts of the body. You can measure different indicators, giving you some side approach to the mechanisms, but you are still using a copy of the natural messages. And that was my obsession, to say, if I know the keyhole in which it goes, I will be able to produce my own key. And if I know all the keyholes, I can, like in a big, like in banks, I can have the combination that will open the door. And this is what we have done. And this is the good point to have. My situation today is that I'm very lucky guy, because thanks to the first work, using the money that went from the royalties of the product and reinvesting, I began to do products in my kitchen, to the point to have an institute with 65 people with different specialties. People coming from, we have 6 nationality of researchers, and we have, for example, a wonderful specialist in bioinformatics, the capability to recreate the shape of a protein in 3Ds, and more than this, to take the genome, take a gene, and create what is encoded in this gene. When you have that, you begin to be able to do some binding, which is very great, because it doesn't make sense to work on ethology, animal welfare, and ignore the fact that you cannot do research without, in some situation, at least creating some uncomfort to animals, sometimes having unfortunately, to sacrifice some of them. Here, we are just very bad with a laptop. And we all admit that it's not a problem. So this laptop, to approach that this way, make that, because we have the library, we have the book with all the letters, not all, but a large number. So if we begin to have the way to detect it, then we can look at the combinations. And this is what we have done recently with the new generation of feline pheromone product. Let me tell you that the great news is that we have achieved the same thing for dogs, and we will come very soon with this family of semiochemicals that are not existing in nature.
Oh, wow.
And this is, I think that this is very important for the future, because the fascinating part with chemical communication is that it begins with bacteria and it finishes with us. And so it is opening a lot of options. When we work, and this is something that we do, when we work on microfungi that could have some pathogenic effects, we know that, for example, when they will divide and will be capable to invade, there are some pheromones that are released that play a role in division. So we are far from anxiety and behavioral medicine, but it's the behavior of bacteria. But you can interfere with the chemical communication. So the range of effects is very, very broad. And you have, I don't say that there are no limits, because there are limits, but having access and to begin to understand the way it works is making that we have more options.
Yeah, it's that. I mean, I was a few years ago, I was at a conference about pain, and they were explaining how, virtually all of the enzyme cascades associated with pain, and you associate with the brain and the complex stuff, you get in unicellular organisms, because they've got to cope with repair. And that's where it comes from. And okay, it gets exapted into other functions and whatever. But yeah, thinking about things of where they come from, they've got to start in a relatively simple way, and they can become really elaborate later on. I think that's a really nice analogy, that having the letters of the alphabet and then seeing the words you can make up from it, I think it's a really nice. So, I mean, we've talked about the past. So what do you think about the future in terms of clinical behavior? What do you think of first of all, you've mentioned already, thank you, about sort of some of the exciting developments, if there's going to be some new products. Where do you think are the sort of big areas that we'll see progress in the next 10 years or something like that? And equally, what do you think are the really big questions that we ought to be tackling? Because
I think that looking at behavioral, if we speak first about behavioral medicine, I think that we have, for me, there are still two big gaps. The first one is that, on the contrary to dermatology, ophthalmology, all the other specialties, vets in general practice still have some difficulty with approaching our field, because they are convinced that if you cannot spend 2 hours or 1 hour and a half with a patient, you cannot do anything. They're afraid with the fact that most of the time the owners are supposed to be your eyes, your ears, except that they just report what they think they have detected and not what they have detected. So we have improved that with, thanks to cell phones. Wonderful for us, because many times people come with a video, and you look at the video and you listen to what they describe.
Yes,
it's so different. It gives you an idea about this terrible gap. So I think that this is a big problem that we have to fix if we cannot have a good approach of basic problems, and especially for the prevention, we cannot move on. The second point is about the crucial question of, I don't say normal, but functional and pathological behavior. because we cannot accept the idea. It's also a big problem in human psychiatry that everything that looks strange or poorly acceptable is abnormal. Otherwise, we have to say, and we all agree that it's not true. We have to say that a scratching cat is pathological, that a spraying cat is pathological, that a dog growling towards someone who is doing something strange is pathological, and doesn't make sense. So I think that for me, the future is first about mixing what we have learned over years about behavior science with more biological science. And you know that it's one of my obsessions, using physiological measurements. Why? Because vets are very strongly trained about that, more than about asking questions to people. So I think that it's the first thing that makes it more feasible. And I think that we can enrich much more. And I think that for the future, depending for how many years we're speaking about that, but I think that something that will enrich is the genomic approach, because it will play a major role first to detect some predisposition to some situation with mutations for genes encoding for some receptors and their association. But also, when I'm speaking about genomic, it's also the expression of the genes to confirm that there is something which is, for example, describing really a profile of chronic situation of stress. Because plasmatic indicators, the worst being cortisol, which is the absolute nightmare, except in the design in lab where you control everything, or except if you can get samples from 1 million individuals of the same species, you have to forget to get some significant results. Birds are a little bit easier with that because corticosteroid seems to be a little bit more reliable, but it's a nightmare. So I think that the expression of genes with the new material, which is now becoming less and less expensive, and the products we need, make that it's a hope. I'd say the same thing for the microbiotes. Microbiome will be very important for chronic stress disorders. I think that if we can evaluate the population, the profile of the population in the gut, or
microbiomes.
Well, microbiomes will be crucial in the future. And regarding the treatments and more specialized approach, I think that we will have to move on and change our minds. And especially, we all understand that from a regulatory point of view, it's always easier to say that a psychotropic drug is made for a given behavioral disorder. We have known, you as me, clomipramine for separation anxiety. And I think it's a stupid and wrong idea. The drug is making that you will give some action to go back to some more balanced synaptic systems, but it's not treating. There is no drug for separation anxiety or for other disorders. And I think that's it's something that we will need to adjust and make that probably we have another approach to drugs. It's something that we have to consider. I have tried it. It's a part of the work I did with the book to try to explain people to use the drugs another way. But it's clearly for regulatory reasons, it's something which is difficult to manage.
Yeah, and I agree with you. It's something you come up against again and again. The regulatory authority wants a condition and they want it defined in a particular way because then they can license the drug, rather than thinking about the drug as a biological intervention. They seem to forget that side of biology, and I think that'd be brilliant if we can move things on. But if you've still got a few more minutes, I don't want to let you go without talking about horses, because I know horses are your passion. So let's talk about that. And
it's not a patient, it's an addiction.
Yeah, I can see at the back.
Yes, I have to.
Looking at your wall behind you, I can see you've got all the horse stuff there.
I will. I can disclose something which is, I'd say, my privilege now for many years, and more, which is that I can ride every given day, and this is the way I begin my days.
Oh wow!
Every day in the week, the 5 first days of the week, I do that for the horse. I first have physical preparation with a coach to make that I can physically do the job and not say that the horse is misworking when it is myself creating the problem to the horse. I don't dare say that I succeed in doing that, but I do my best. So it is every given morning, except Sunday, Saturday, Sunday, I first have 1 hour of physical preparation, and then I ride. Wow. And I ride 6 hours a week minimum.
Wow.
But I'm very lucky because it is 5 minutes. Our institute has also a place where we have the horses for research and also for riding. So it's a passion, and it's a passion which has led me also to be more and more interested in having another look at horses. Because 2 days ago, again, someone was telling me, oh yes, horses are very nice, but they are so stupid. And I told this person, you just don't know anything about horses, because when you work first, when you live with them, you learn very quickly that they are very wise, as every creatures are very wise in the world, in their world, which includes our world. And this is where they're very, very clever, because they can do many things. And when you measure, and it's something we have done and we try to do more and more, we have recently published with Thiago Mendoza, we have published a paper about generalization in horses. Horses can do incredible work. And I think that those who create the feeling that they are stupid is humans, because when I'm teaching, I'm telling my students, we do with horses exactly what some professors of mathematics do, creating so much stress that 2 and 2, you don't know what to answer. It's not because you are a stupid boy or girl and you know perfectly that 2 and 2 it's 4, but suddenly nothing. Yeah. And horses, we do the same. We put them in such an incredible level of stress that sometimes they look to have no longer any kind of solution. When you let them use their skills, including in equitation, and then you have, what I have discovered also along my work is that we should read much more the old authors who have described the science of equitation. The wording is very difficult, has changed, and it's very difficult in Old French for French. I have had access to books in German or in English. It's also sometimes very difficult, but when you read it, they give a lot of information.
My late father was a great believer in that he always used to say, and he loved horses, and that's why he actually became a vet, is because he wanted to work with the horses. But the war was on, and after the war it was all very different because there was a great mechanization, so it became frustrating for him. But he used to sort of say, never underestimate a man's wisdom, because, and especially when it comes to horses, if they've, he grew up with people who literally lived with the horses. You had ostlers, they lived above the horse, and their observations. And it's interesting because, it's like your history, it's about being a good observer. And you might not have the scientific method, but they've made connections, and there's really good hypotheses that, they may not have the scientific data, but they've sort of tested those hypotheses to work out what's going on. And one of the things that many years ago we were looking at, somebody came to me and asked me whether or not I thought that was there an association between sort of variation in cribbing with the geography of the land? Because he had this idea that cribbing seemed to be less common in these horses on the chalk downs. And I wasn't aware of anything. And I started to look into it. And, at that time, people were talking about cribbing and its association with saliva and buffering effects. And obviously with the chalk downs, you've got alkali. And I found one of my dad's old books from 1880 or whatever, Mayhew's book, and it said, traditional treatment for cribbing in horses is you put in the manger, the food bowl, salt. What does that do? Increase salivation. Chalk, antacid, and chaff, bark, fiber to increase salivation. And it's all there from 150 years ago. And you think,
and you have the same thing when you read a book from the 18th century by La Guérinière, who was professor of equitation of our King Louis XV. He describes the misuse of punishments and the benefits, the higher benefit of rewards in a way that we could sign ourselves immediately. And he had no idea about that. That's something that I think that those people, and this is something interesting. Why? Because those people were just observing. And yesterday I had a discussion with a young researcher in our team. She's running a study about chemical communication in horses with the sexual pheromone from stallions and mares. And she's not a horse person, which is fine. I think she has 3 eyes. But she has been just reading the literature, and she was presenting me some hypotheses about the way she was going to run. So after reading big amount of literature, and I told her, my mentor from my PhD told me when I began my research, I give you 2 papers, and you are not allowed to read anything more before you begin to observe. Just two papers, because they will tell you what is the main question around your work. And then you observe. When you will come back to me and describe things that I don't know, then we will go and look at other books. And I told her yesterday, here is the phone number of a famous breeder of horses who has stallions and mares. Go there, spend the time you need, and you come back and we will discuss. Because I think, and this is not just about horses, I think the best advice to give to young researchers, young colleagues beginning, is please do not try to just see what people have described. Go and watch. And if you pretend to do ethology, it is your job. You must first observe. And many people say ethology, it's a kind of passive science. No, it's not passive. It's a self-discipline, because you have to stop. You are a sponge, and you must observe and take it and begin to organize your observation. Otherwise, you will miss so many things.
Yeah, and it's that discipline of not interpreting what is in front of you, but just describing it. And we always want to impose our view on the world, and and that's the real skill in ethology, is to step back, look, and as Tim Bergen said, it starts with that inductive. You do the observations, and then you formulate your hypothesis. And that's the way that ethology is meant to be done. And too often, as you say, people are just rushing in with the experiments and not actually understanding that bigger context. But anyway, I have to ask you this. I mean, I know you're a passionate horse rider. Have you always been a passionate horse rider, though? I mean, ever since you were young, or is it something that came later?
Yes, I will accept to look very ridiculous with what I will answer. As as long as I remember me as a child, I have been fascinated by horses. I remember when I was 5 or 6, I was playing with two friends, a girl and a boy, and we were. It was Zorro. Zorro was the star on the TV screens, and we were horses. We were playing that we were horses. I remember because this girl who was working with us had decided that the rule was that girls were always white horses and boys were black horses. And my mother sometimes was exhausted when we were all together working in the apartment because we were running like crazy and we were doing all the vocalization of horses. So I was fascinated by horses, but unable to ride because I was having severe allergy with asthma each time I was entering in the stable.
Oh, wow.
And before there were some treatments, I was unable to ride. Each time I was trying, each year I was saying my mother, Mom, I'm sure it will be better. And we were going to an equitation school. And 15 minutes later, she was bringing me into the car, unable to drive. So it has been a long time. And I have been obliged to wait to be 17-year-old to begin to ride.
So
after that, I have been.
So do you still have to? So do you still have to take antihistamines every day? Or
no, I have two other solutions. When I was preparing my horses myself, because my problem is with the dust of the stable. Yeah. So if I brush them myself, I have to do that outside.
Okay.
Inside the stable, it's horrible. And so I have trained some of my horses when I was obliged to do this job myself, to accept to do that with a vacuum cleaner. It was hard the two first times, but in the end, they were appreciating very much this kind of message. And now I have someone to do that for me, and I begin to pet my horse after there is no more dust around.
That's one of the advantages.
Because I need this physical touch. I like very much. I spend time playing with the horse, for example, and for nothing, just playing.
Yeah.
And so it's there are, for me, there are fascinating animals. I have dogs, but it's both are for me so incredible.
Yeah, and I mean, I often say, for horses, people should be able to control a horse on the ground before they get on its back.
Yeah.
Because if you can't watch a horse anticipate its behavior and control it, then you're going to over depend on the aids, and they are meant to be aids. They're not supposed to be tools. And I mean, I'm not a good rider. I love horses, but I'm not a good rider, and I feel sorry for a horse if I get on its back. So I don't ride very often. And I just have terrible balance as well. My wife used to be a gymnast. She has really good balance, and she had her own horse when she was growing up, but never learned formally, but just because of her natural balance, and you just look at it and think, she's got it. But it's only now that she's learning sort of, oh, this is what you do, and this is how you're supposed to do this, that, and the other, as opposed to trial and error. But anyway, I better not keep you any longer. Thank you so much. It's been lovely to catch up with you. You're looking well. And as I said, I really enjoyed our chat today. And I hope we will get the chance to meet up in person before too long. We're looking forward to it.
Me too. It was a great pleasure.
So thanks a lot, and look forward to catching up with you again soon. Thanks a lot. Bye now.
Bye.